Our theme this year is the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Proverbs 16, verse 9. And of course, we continue talking about our cycle of loving neighbors and then moving them to loving God, getting them to worship. Was not our worship so far just awesome? With a little bit of change in attitude in the way that we approach worship, it completely changes the way that we sing. It changes the sound, it changes the tone, it changes our entire approach to worship. Getting people to fall in love with God means that we ourselves are convinced that we're in love with God. And then, of course, moving people to serving others, getting people by the hand and saying, let's work together for the kingdom of Christ. Let's work together and serve and protect others. I have a question for you this morning as we celebrate the resurrection and we really think about that and wrap our minds around that. What is it that is the most urgent, important thing in your life? Is it a family member? Is it keeping family members alive? Is it getting family members to heaven? Is it, I don't know. What is it that gives you that sense of urgency that I need to act right now? I can't rest another minute until I carry this through. What is it that's of the most importance to you? As you think about that, there's a saying from the late actress Audrey Hepburn, and she said back in the day, the most important thing is to enjoy your life. To be happy, it's all that matters. Sounds good on the surface, but my question is, what happens when we're not happy? All of us have experienced times in our life when we're not happy. So is the most important thing in life to be happy? I think it's a fair question. I saw a thing on 60 Minutes Australia. It was an interview with Ricky Gervais. I like Ricky Gervais. I think he's a funny actor, comedian. He's been in a lot of movies that we like. But he was asked in this segment on 60 Minutes Australia, what will death be like when it comes? Here was part of Ricky's answer. He said, the best thing about death is you won't know about it. It's like being stupid. It's only painful for others, so I'm not that bothered by it. By the way, Ricky he's not a believer. He's like a very loud and proud atheist. He doesn't hate Christians. It's just not for him. And he's very, very clear, very honest about that. But he said, it's like being stupid. It's only painful for others, so I'm not bothered by it. And then he says, we all ponder the universe. And then he talked about the chances of us coming into existence are almost nilch, like none. Statistically, for us to come together as human, living, breathing people, he said, statistically, it's an impossibility. But instead of saying that makes me fall down in awe and wonder, he says this. That just means we're not special, we're just lucky. And then he went on and he said, the most important thing about life is to eat, drink, and make friends. I thought that's convincing, that he's convinced that that's the hill he's going to die on, literally. And so the question is, what is it about us, what is it about Christians that convinces people like Ricky Gervais or like anybody else that we really have the Holy Spirit of God, that we are destined to get to heaven, and that there is nothing, and I mean nothing, that will stop us to get there? What is it that's of the utmost importance to us? You see, I think the problem with us Christians is that more often than not, we're not very convincing. It's not that we don't love the Lord. It's not that we don't love each other. It's not that we don't love our neighbors. We all do. I know many, many, many Christians who are madly in love with God. They love their neighbors. It's that they're not that convincing that they're madly in love with God. So it's not that we don't love the Lord, it's that our words, our actions, and our expressed emotions aren't very convincing. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, said this about the resurrection. The whole chapter 15, is about the resurrection. Here's what Paul says. I'm going to reread what was read for us this morning by text, and then I'm going to go deeper into this text here. Paul said, "For I delivered to you," that is Corinthians, "I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." For Paul, this is the most important thing in his life. This is it. If he could boil everything down and say, as he did in Philippians, it's all garbage, it's all rubbish, everything else doesn't matter. Compared to the surpassing greatness of Christ, nothing else matters. It's all crap, as Paul used in that passage in Philippians. It's the word that he uses. The Greek word skubalon means feces. It's a slang term that means human feces. It's garbage. But for Paul, while everything else doesn't matter, this is what does. I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So Paul's saying, look, it's so important that Christ died according to the Scriptures, that he was buried according to the Scriptures, that my mic keeps cutting out, doesn't it? Do you want to switch to this one? It keeps cutting out. Oh, DP's asleep back there again. Oh. He spent all that energy making that little label that he put on my back. But Paul says this is the most important thing, that nothing else matters, that Christ, if I die today, it's not going to be because I failed to tell you about the resurrection of Christ. For Paul, it was the most important thing from the time he woke up until the time he fell asleep. The most important thing to Paul was to talk about the resurrection. And he goes on, picking up where Paul left off. He says, "For I'm the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle." In other words, it's not about me. It's not about me being a great speaker and being well-versed in the Bible. It's not about that. I'm the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and this grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. It's pretty convincing, but Paul's not done. Paul goes on and he says, "Now, if Christ proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain." In fact, Paul says we're even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. Do you hear what he's saying? The resurrection is that important, that if we miss the resurrection of Christ, or if we go into the resurrection of Christ even half-heartedly, we are misrepresenting God, we're misrepresenting the kingdom, we're misrepresenting Christ, and none of our faith matters. Are we convinced in the resurrection? I think it's interesting, the story of the resurrection. It was pretty convincing. God could have raised Christ, and, it could have been like this quiet thing, and, just a handful of people were aware. But Christ showed up that day. God showed up that day. Angels showed up that day, and there were guards that were blinded by the brightness of God. The glory of God blinded them, and they were terrified. There was a big stone that was moved away. Christ came out of his tomb, but it wasn't just Christ. The scriptures tell us that there were hundreds of people who were raised from the dead and were walking around. Can you imagine seeing that? That's pretty convincing. That it's not just Christ who's going to be raised, but God demonstrated that other people who've been in these tombs for years are coming to life and they're walking out of these tombs alive. That's pretty convincing. And so Paul is fully vested, fully convinced, and fully committed to preaching the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He goes on. This is skipping way down because he has a lot more to talk about, but I'm just skipping ahead to verse 35. Paul says, "But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? You foolish person, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. For not all flesh is the same, but there's one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and there are earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly one is of one kind, and the glory of the earthly is of another. There's one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for star differs from star in glory. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown in a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there's a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. This is why Paul spends so much time talking about the difference between the flesh and the spirit. When he gives the fruit of the Spirit, Paul gives this big, long laundry list of, if you're walking in the flesh, these are all the things that you'll be doing. If you walk in the Spirit, these are all the things you'll be doing. And you can't have one foot on one side and one foot on the other. You can't do it. It's not possible. Paul was convinced that the only way to walk as a Christian is to walk as if we have a spiritual body or a spiritual side. To walk in the Spirit or to walk with the Spirit. Paul uses that language often. Paul goes on in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 47. He says, the first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are of dust. And as is the man of heaven, so are also those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. What he's saying is when we die, we immediately bear this image of Christ. We become like him. We walk with him. We're raised with him in his resurrection. Death is not the final stay. Paul goes on and he quotes from Hosea. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Paul's quoting from Hosea to say, look, death shouldn't make us Christians quake in our boots, and it shouldn't make us say things like, I don't know, when you die, it's like, being stupid. Only other people are aware, It only affects other people, not you. That's not what Paul is saying. He says, when you die, there's a victory that happens. As Christians, we become victorious. We're raised up a new spiritual body with Christ to walk with Christ forever. Paul's pretty convincing. And this is what was on Paul's mind. It was what was in Paul's mouth. And Paul could not live a single day without telling people about the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Not a single day. And so the question I have for us today, again, is how convincing are we? When other people look at us and look at our lives and hear the things we talk about and what consumes our time, are they convinced? Are they truly convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt that we are living in the shadow of the resurrection, and that we are so passionate about it like Paul was, that we say this is of most or first importance? Are people convinced of that when they look at us? Is the resurrection of first importance in our lives? And if it's not, I like to use the term, we need to do some inventory and figure out what's in our lives and what we need to cut out. And it sounds strange even saying this, but what do we need to cut out to make room for Jesus? Guys, we don't have long on this earth. And that's not really a bad thing. If we're Christians and we're true believers, that's not a depressing thing. That's not a sad thing. That just means we get to heaven sooner. But are we convinced of the importance of it as Paul is? I pray that as you go out today and as we celebrate today, we're going to continue celebrating. We have songs that are all tied around celebration, celebrating the resurrection. As we celebrate, let's continue to go out there. Don't let your celebration fall off as soon as you walk out of here and be like, okay, now I got to do the chores and, get ready to do all this stuff. Be convincing. You guys are convincing now. I'm telling you. The singing, your hearts are there. You guys are convinced. Keep that conviction up. Let other people see Christ's goodness in you. Love you guys. If there's anybody who has not yet taken that step to put Christ on in baptism, or if you have prayer needs, we'd invite you to come up as we all stand and sing a song together.